Recently, I've gotten really into a genre of games known as time loop games. These are games that, in some way or another, incorporate a Groundhog's Day style time loop into their game loop. Today I wanted to cover a couple of these, both for your entertainment and so I can finally get my thoughts on some of these games out. I'll rate them on a 10-point scale as we go, but keep in mind my opinion on these games is only based on my limited knowledge with reviewing things. Oh, also, as we go along, I will probably be mentioning you-know-who a lot, as most of this genre seems to take inspiration from it, as well as being probably the most well-known and most easy-to-compare game for a lot of these. I'll be covering a lot that you've probably already heard of before, but I've also included some niche picks in here for the more curious among you. Anyways, let's start off this video. Start Again, a prologue, at face value, is pretty straightforward in how it works. It's an RPG about traversing the final castle of a long adventure, solving simple puzzles as you go, and eventually fighting the king, all with the aforementioned time loop mechanic sending you back to the start if you die at any point in that process. What mainly sets this game apart is how it handles those elements, mostly in terms of story. Being an indie RPG made in RPG Maker, this game has a pretty heavy story focus, specifically on the player character, Sifrin. Out of his 5-man band invading the castle frozen in time, he's the only one who actually realizes this isn't the first time they're going through this. This isn't the first time a game has had you as the only one aware of the loop. I mean, Majora is a pretty clear example of that, but this game, more than any other, hammers in the effects of that on our silly white boy here pretty damn hard. Every conversation, from beginning to end and around again, shows us behind Sif's front-facing happy-go-lucky attitude. Behind every sly joke and mediocre pun, we're shown the horror of how it feels to relive the same events hundreds, if not thousands of times over again. It works well with the heartbreaking symbolism of hiding your problems behind a veil of jests and jokes, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't hit pretty hard over the countless times I've done that in my life, along with the millions of people who I know feel the same. If it wasn't clear, it's a pretty damn strong story, reminding me of the indie-stylized experimental emotional symbolism. Try saying that 5 times fast, behind works like Bad End Theater that work well into feeling like a very personalized experience. Gameplay-wise, unlike the relatively lackluster performance you tend to see in this department from RPG Maker games, this game actually does a pretty good job of setting itself apart. The puzzles, while not particularly challenging, require a fair amount of exploration at first and world knowledge later on. This formula for a smaller game with a time loop system works incredibly well. Being an RPG game, there's also a combat system that's relatively competent. It has a unique rock-paper-scissors element to it that requires you to look at your enemy's hands of all things to figure out what kind of attack to use on them. The system actually works super well in diversifying gameplay, and not only does it force you to actually think about your moves and look at your enemies instead of, just spamming A, but it also changes your strategy depending on what type of attack you have to use and who in your party is privy to using that kind of attack. Oh, it said it. I was supposed to... Okay, the second time playing the game, I didn't know that if you select the first option, then it will tell you this stuff. Oh my god. I just had to figure this stuff out! It makes for a genuinely enjoyable combat system I found myself messing around with a lot, especially in the king fight. My only issues with it would be a lack of interesting enemy types, and a lack of reason to fight the enemies. I'd love to see something like an enemy hiding their hands until you do some kind of attack, or maybe an enemy with constantly shifting hands you have to think on your feet around. As for a reason to fight, I'd love to gain some kind of stronger reward, maybe leveling up faster to grant a lot of abilities if you take the time to fight stuff in a run, as well as a general higher pacing for combat, or even an ability that lets you insta-kill enemies on the overworld if they're weak enough. Overall, the system is really great. My only complaints come in the form of just, things I'd like to see added in rather than things I'd like to see leave. I just think it needs a couple bits of tightening up. I'd rate this game, let's say, 8 out of 10, with a silly little hat on top to show I like it. This game works really well, and I'm excited to see the sequel in Stars in Time. I won't say much since I haven't tried the demo as of writing this script, but if what I've said interests you at all, I'd recommend checking out the demo and buying Start Again if you find yourself privy to this style.
why do they call it Deathloop if the loop isn't dead?
I won't be the first one to say that Deathloop didn't exactly hit the mark on how to develop a time loop game. Despite the core idea of gaining information to explore more areas of the game as each loop progresses, the game doesn't really know what to do with itself outside of that concept. Levels are large and do change over the progression of time, but ways you can interact with how the level will be later in the loop seem to be limited to a few key events rather than a cohesive environment. It feels like more of a remix of a level each time of day rather than a slowly changing level over time. Gameplay is incredibly forgiving in terms of the loop system, to where it never feels like you actually have to care about it. Time never actually moves forward unless you decide it does by either moving to a new area or just selecting it from the menu. Along with this, the game gives you 3 lives to work with at all times, and they reset every single time you move to a new area, making the danger of accidentally ending your loop practically non-existent. This lack of reset danger, by the way, isn't an inherently negative thing. Majora never really has a threat to ending your loop in a scenario where you're always in control of the loop. The difference here is that while Majora's control setup ends with a loop that's generally positive for you, Deathloop's loop system is only ever a hindrance for you, actively backtracking on your progress whenever it happens. I actually think this would be an interesting take on the time loop formula, taking more from roguelikes and actual time loop games, but as stated before in the game called Deathloop, you hardly ever die in loop when you don't want to. Even when you do, the game establishes a system early on that lets you keep your weapons from the previous loop, giving yet another safety blanket to this fucking pillow fort of a game. That's not to say the game is nothing but bad, by the way. Most of the stuff I talked about is at least semi-optional, letting you experience the game with less leniency than they seem to want you to have. Along with this, the core gunplay is pretty solid. I had a lot of fun with a sort of stealth and movement combo build where I would stealth into my enemies until my dumbass would get caught and rush in guns blazing. The game has a lot of opportunities for diverse playstyles here, and I enjoyed that element quite a lot. The writing is also pretty damn good too. I enjoyed the dynamic between Colt and Juliana with their constantly killing each other and then seeing each other the next day kind of banter. They really nailed a lot of the fundamentals of a standard fun game with a pretty strong load of commendable minute-to-minute gameplay elements, fun writing, decent music, and a stellar fucking leather jacket for my main man. That shit is going on my eBay cart right now. It's a shame then that this game seems to be so scared to really go anywhere with the time loop mechanic and constantly holds back on what could be an awesome new addition to one of my favorite video game genres. I'd rate it, Come Down Machine out of 10. Good fundamental songs, but too scared to do anything new. New Abnormal is the best album, by the way. That's a hill I'm willing to die on. It kind of feels like cheating to mention a game that's definitely about time but not necessarily about loops, but it felt close enough to the topic and I wanted to talk about this game considering the following for it is frankly criminal for how well made of a story it is. Anyways, this game is a visual novel, following the story of the player character Time, along with her friend Space. The basic idea here is that being the embodiment of time, you have a pretty firm control of the pacing of the story, being able to move not just forwards, but also backwards, along with a reset functionality for emergencies. This being the Majora time loop bit of this game. It's a pretty cool concept that subverts the typical save and load to get new ending structure that visual novels tend to have into a mechanic ingrained directly into the story. It kind of reminds me of Undertale with the save and load themes working with the story. It's an interpretation of the concept that works especially well here, with the abstract realm of space and a simple, small story that keeps the concept fresh. Though, considering this game's length and the fact that Bad End Theater exists, I can't really call it my favorite visual novel, not by a bit. I really don't have much to say about this game that wouldn't spoil the later parts of it, so I'll just follow the principle of this game and keep this review short. I'd rate it a Teaching Jake About the Camcorder January 97 out of 10. Pretty short and close to the creator's best work, but beaten out by a different work that's at least twice as long. Oh, and hey, this has time loops too. Ah! Ah! Let me land, you jackass! I swear, I'm gonna fucking get on this island, start fixing my ship, and then it's gonna, like, kill me. Where was it? Landing gear? There we go. Can I get in my ship? Let me get in my ship. There we go. Ah, no, see, we're fine. We're totally fine. Okay. Out of all the time loop games I've played, Outer Wilds is probably the closest to Majora that any of them get. It's an adventure game where you go around a world with about 5 central areas, learning important information and finding ways to progress, even within a system of a constantly resetting world. The key difference lies in the central gameplay, with Majora being, well, a Zelda game. Puzzles, combat rooms, dungeons, typical stuff for a game like that. In Outer Wilds' case, it plays more like a narrative exploration game, similar to the likes of Edith Finch and Gone Home, but with a stronger focus on open exploration and oxygen or fuel management. This gives Outer Wilds a pretty strong sense of cohesion with its narrative. By taking from one of the most narratively focused genres out there, it hits a sense of a vast connected world that's become a hopeful staple with this genre. Aside from the core gameplay loop though, I found a couple more things interesting about how this game tackles its premise. For one, the loop system doesn't seem to be as ingrained into the experience. Early game especially is mostly just bouncing around from planet to planet and getting some basic ideas down of the world you're a part of. This might seem like an issue, and if the entire game went on like this, I could seriously see it becoming one, but luckily after a while the game starts playing with the time loop concept more in interesting ways. The Hourglass Twins are probably the best example of this, being a connected set of planets with a large mass of sand slowly shifting from one planet to another over any given loop. On one planet, this reveals large structures covered in sand which eventually serve greater purpose as you learn more about them later into the game. On the other planet, it slowly raises the sand level in a series of claustrophobic caves, forcing you to rush through them to get the information required to progress. This isn't even touching on the atmosphere and soundtrack of this game, by the way, which is probably some of the best I've ever seen in a game. The soundtrack is highly ambient, but never unnoticeable, weaving in and out of dead silence and light melodies depending on where you are in the game. It kind of reminds me of Halo in that sense, where the soundtrack is used sparingly, making its presence all that much more important when it is present in the more scenic and narratively dense areas. The environments themselves are fantastic as well, but I won't go into much detail over those considering I'm not an expert on environment and archaeology design, and with the explorative nature of the game, I believe you'd have more fun experiencing them yourself rather than having them described to you. What is... Wait, what... No. No, wait, shit. These kind of systems, along with the incredibly well tied together story and genuine peak atmosphere that Outer Wilds presents, creates one of the strongest time loop games, and one of the most well written and cohesive video game stories out there. I'd give it an existentially relaxing, adventurous trip in the woods out of 10. Now go play it.
Okay, can I just say something?
Look at the screen share.
This is just to make sure, like, if the epileptic kids didn't catch the memo by looking on the box, this is just to fuck them over for not listening.
Those of you familiar with this genre in any way probably saw this coming from a mile away, but hey, what can I say? Sometimes the obvious pick is the right one. There's a lot to talk about for Majora. First of all, it's easily the most popular, hailing from the ever-popular Legend of Zelda franchise and being released directly after what's possibly the series' most influential game. That's not to discredit Majora either though, especially considering every game on this list most likely derives at least some level of inspiration from this game, being one of the first time loop games ever released and establishing a lot of the mechanics and styles used in these types of games today. For starters, the 3-day system with a constantly reset world by your own choosing is a fundamentally genius system that seriously changes how you think about playing Zelda. You can't just go around and do anything whenever anymore. You have to make sure you know what time things happen, where they happen, and what you need to do to complete them. A lot of it is about exploration and research into the world. This, by proxy, seriously changes how you view the land you explore. Termina feels so much more dense and so much more real than Hyrule ever did, where every single person has some sort of schedule and things they need to do across the 3 days that you have to learn to get the items you need and help the people in need. Speaking of, the characters in this game are genuinely fantastic. The whole game is about the stories of individual people, their families, their lives, and how all of them know it's about to end. The time loop plays less of an active role in the story and more of a tragic vehicle used to guide our protagonist through this utterly doomed land as he watches the same people experience the same trauma over and over again. In fact, even in gameplay, I'd say the time loop isn't as prevalent as it is in other games. However, unlike in something like Deathloop, where that felt like a setback to an otherwise strong game, game, Majora actually does a great job at using the looping system at just the right amount to where, despite constantly reliving the same 3 days, you never feel like you're repeating yourself. Every loop feels like you've accomplished something new and slowly moved your way to being able to conquer this game and defeat the plague that is Majora. Even things you have to repeat, like clearing dungeons to make certain side quests accessible, are made quicker after beating it for the first time by letting you warp straight to the boss. In general, this feels like the overall philosophy this game has on progression. The world itself never changes, but the way it's designed makes you able to traverse it quicker and in new ways. Clocktown is a great example of this, with several elements of the town always being in sight, never changing, but only accessible if you have the hook shot, or Kamaro's mask, or the bomb. Hey, what the fuck is this? Yeah, that's right, this game has fucking baller speedruns and shit. Relatively easy skips to insane tech to fucking code manipulation. Yeah, that stuff's all here. Being a reused engine of Ocarina of Time, a game where people warp directly to the final boss in under 5 minutes. This speedrun tech is genuinely so cool to me, and while it isn't anything intended or particularly effective of my opinion on the game, it still makes me really happy to see cool stuff like this in games I really like. Aside from unintentional stuff, the sillier and lighter elements of this game are also really nice too. A couple of the masks, some wacky NPCs, and some of the areas in this game are really just charming and fun.
Why am I defending toilet towers?
Toilet tower defense.
Mr. President, the second toilet was hit.
Most of this game is in fact serious in some way, with darker elements, parts that tug at your heartstrings, and even moments of genuine respect for some of the characters are what fill the majority of this game to its brim. But the bits of genuine charm, happiness, and silliness just make it all the more enjoyable for me. Overall, Majora is a fantastic game. It does a lot with everything it has, and makes an unforgettable world I hold very dear to me. Majora is my favorite Zelda game, and one of my favorite games of all time. Change does come, even in worlds of loops and repeats. Each of these games changes as you play them, and even more than I can say for most games. One thing that won't change though is my love for all these games, and especially my love for Majora. With that in mind, guys, I give Majora's Mask my completionist rating of completed out of 10. Anyways, have you heard of this genre I've been checking out recently? Here, check it out. So,